Good morning. Please could Professor Machin be sworn?
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Could you please give your full name to the inquiry?
It's Richard Machin.
Professor Machin, you have helpfully provided an expert report for the purposes of Module 7. Thank you. We can see it displayed there. A report, namely an analysis of the effectiveness of COVID-19 financial support and the impact on adherence with the test, trace and isolate system. We can see you signed the relevant declaration, expert declaration, on the 26th of March of 2025. And can I ask you to confirm are the contents of the expert report we see true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
That's correct.
Thank you. Professor Machin, your report will be published with all the finer analysis and detail that we have within it. But I wonder if you could assist us then, first of all, with some detail, first of all, about you and your background, please. And we see that at page 4. Thank you. It's right, isn't it, that you are an associate professor in social policy in the social work, care and community department at Nottingham Trent University?
That's correct.
You specialise in research on the UK social security system, poverty and financial well-being.
Yes, that's
And
correct.
then you've given us some detail of your recent research, but significantly, your COVID-19 research explores financial support available to vulnerable groups and local government experience of managing the pandemic. And you then give detail of the other matters to which you're a co-editor. Is there anything else by way of your background and experience that you'd wish to detail before we deal with your report?
No, that's comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Machin, can we then look at the executive summary of your report, please? You detail that the report evaluates the effectiveness of financial assistance that was available to support and encourage self-isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you tell us that the main focus is on self-isolation payments that were introduced in 2020 in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. And you tell us that these payments provided financial support to people on low incomes who were required to self-isolate, but who would lose income as a result of not being able to work from home.
That's correct.
Now, we probably won't get into the finer details of how each of the schemes operated across the 4 nations, but it's right, isn't it, that within the report you do a detailed analysis as to how the schemes operated in each of the 4 nations?
That's correct, and there is some significant differences between the schemes in those 4 nations, the details of which are in the report.
Thank you. And I think you've also, perhaps if we go to one of those now, you've helpfully provided tables within the report. If we go, first of all, to page 6. You've provided essentially a summary of the schemes themselves within the report there. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Thank you. And if we then briefly, if we go to the next page, please, page 7. Thank you. We see Northern Ireland scheme. And then can we go to, please, page 87? Thank you. And if we just go to 88 as well. It's right, isn't it, that you've also stripped down the overview of the strengths limitations of the 4 self-isolation schemes in the UK also to try and assist with the headlines, but more detailed analysis we see in your report.
That's correct.
Thank you. Can we then please turn to your key findings, please, which are on page 8. And Professor Machin, I want to use this as the foundation to give context to the overview of your findings and recommendations, appreciating that in the latter part of the report you give a huge amount of detail to support the recommendations that we'll look at together in summary. And then we'll work together to some particular areas where we would ask for your assistance. So let's start with the key findings, please. First of all, at paragraph 4, you detail that you have found that there is clear evidence that the ability and willingness to self-isolate is linked to financial status. You detail that the UK government acknowledged the risk that people would not self-isolate because of their financial circumstances. And your report recommends that self-isolation payments should sit alongside other forms of non-financial and practical support, such as food parcels, delivery of medication, referrals to voluntary sector organisations for wellbeing and practical support.
Yes, so I think there's two clear points there. The research undertaken shows very strong links between financial status and ability to self-isolate. But alongside that, non-financial support is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Now we would then look at paragraph 5, please. You detail that the self-isolation payment schemes were developed and implemented at speed and evolved over time to reflect the changing dynamics of the pandemic. You tell us that while changes were implemented to enhance the schemes, these changes also caused administrative complications and contributed to a low public understanding of the payments.
That's correct. So the timeliness of self-isolation payments is absolutely key. And there were challenges around the schemes being rolled out quickly, which were understandable given the size of the task and the unexpected pandemic. I think what is important from the research is that when schemes are launched, there needs to be really clear systems and communications that support effective administration of the payments, and sometimes that was lacking. We could sometimes see inconsistent information on central government and local government websites. The systems weren't always in place that the NHS COVID app could make a referral for test and trace support payments. So certainly the timeliness was an issue, which is understandable. But I think the systems that underpin the self-isolation schemes could certainly have been more effective.
Thank you. Now we turn then to paragraph 6, please. You detail there's an important relationship between self-isolation payments and the broader social security system. Self-isolation payments were introduced alongside a significant range of temporary COVID-19 amendments to the social security system. For some people, the temporarily enhanced levels of social security payments provided protection from the need to claim self-isolation support payments. For others, a newly established entitlement to social security benefits acted as a passport to eligibility for self-isolation support. Can you perhaps just be absolutely clear what you mean by that paragraph?
Yes, so the government during the pandemic did introduce a significant range of enhancements to the social security system, most notably an increase in the rate of universal credit by £20. For some people, those enhancements to the social security system would have contributed to a lessening in financial hardship and would perhaps have meant that they didn't need to rely on self-isolation payments. But across all 4 nations of the UK, self-isolation payments, the eligibility was linked to entitlement to a means-tested benefit. So, for example, we saw a leap in the number of universal credit claimants during the pandemic from just under 3 million to 6 million people. So those newly entitled universal credit claimants would have potentially had that passport to be able to claim self-isolation support.
Thank you. Now, you make findings at paragraphs 7 and 8, which I think are perhaps self-explanatory as to the impact on mental health and psychological distress. Is there anything you want to add in respect of those paragraphs, please, Professor Machin?
So the overwhelming evidence, both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, is that there's very clear links between financial hardship and mental health issues. And so a period of self-isolation, if that is associated with financial difficulties, for many people that would have also led to some emotional challenges, to issues around mental health. So really the emphasis on these paragraphs is that comprehensive financial support is not just a matter of pounds and pence in the pocket. That has a really significant impact on overall well-being.
Thank you. Can we then please move through what a necessarily summary of your key recommendations that are expanded in the report, but can we work through those together now, please? You detail at paragraph 9, future self-isolation payments should be delivered via an employer-delivered earnings replacement model. This model was used to deliver the coronavirus job retention scheme and self-employed income support scheme and could be adapted to deliver self-isolation payments. The adoption of this model would create parity between those compelled to be at home for self-isolation purposes and those required to be at home because of their normal employment was suspended, To ensure scheme recognition, self-isolation payments should have a distinct branding. For example, self-isolation earnings replacement grant. Entitlement to a self-isolation payment should automatically trigger referral to local authority for holistic wraparound support. Could I ask you just to expand on that key recommendation, please?
Yes, in many ways, this is the most important recommendation in the report. And it's a matter of policy priority and quite a difficult decision to come to make that recommendation. So to provide some context, the self-isolation payments that were delivered in the four nations were administered by local authorities. And there was some merit to those schemes in terms of local authorities having systems in place and knowledge of their local communities. However, there were many inefficiencies and challenges that local authorities had with those payments. And so overall, that certainly led me to recommend that self-isolation payments would have been much more efficiently administered if they were done on a central basis rather than on a local basis. This would have created parity between people who are required to self-isolate and those whose employment's interrupted because their jobs are no longer available for a period. Much greater recognition by the public of the coronavirus job retention scheme, commonly referred to as furlough, and also within those schemes, some flexibility to change the earnings replacement levels for people who are self-isolating. So it really concluded that there would be much greater efficiencies in a centralised scheme such as those. Also, though, absolutely key, that a centralised scheme potentially would lose some of that local knowledge, and so alongside that delivery model, people who apply for self-isolation support payment, there's a recommendation there should be this automatic referral to a local authority for additional support, non-financial support, practical help.
Thank you. Can we then look, please, at paragraph 10?
Sorry, just before you move on, maybe you're about to go to it, and forgive me, Ms Cartwright, but while it's in my head, how do you cater for the self-employed under this recommendation?
So the self-employed, it would be the eligibility rules for self-employed people would be reflected in some of the rules for the self-employed income support scheme, and to use the criteria from that scheme as a model for self-isolation payments.
Thank you. And perhaps then, with you arriving at a centralised scheme as the way forward, have you given thought about who the relevant stakeholders and departments are that need to have the discussion to essentially look at what would be necessary to implement a centralised scheme?
Yes, so certainly that would need to be employers groups, Treasury, HMRC, and there would be some important conversations around data sharing and protocols.
Thank you. Can I ask you additionally, we've heard some evidence from the Treasury that also it would require the involvement of the Department of Work and Pensions. Is that similarly a stakeholder you think that would be necessary for these discussions?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. So paragraph 10, you tell us self-isolation payment scheme should have a rapid review process. Can you give some context to that recommendation, please? Yes,
so there was a very high number of refusals of self-isolation payments during the pandemic. In England and Wales, there was no capacity for an applicant to review those decisions. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, they did have review processes. And that really is just good practice around the social welfare system to allow people to challenge that, where there might be quick and obvious errors that have been made. There are some challenges around a review process that creates an additional administrative step, but that has been suggested as an element of best practice for delivering welfare payments to people on low incomes.
Thank you. Can we then move to your next recommendation, and perhaps to give some context to this, certainly the Every Story Matter record that the inquiries obtained, it indicates that there was wide-scale either lack of knowledge or lack of understanding of the schemes, and perhaps then having given context to some wider evidence the inquiries received. you tell us that central government and local government websites should include a self-isolation payment eligibility checker.
Yes, so certainly in the initial stages of the pandemic, there was an inconsistency between information on central and local government websites. There is some evidence to suggest that when the self-isolation payments were launched in England, there was a complete lack of information whatsoever on the English government website. So I think that would be a really quick and easy win for people to be able to check in an online way whether they were entitled, and might also create some efficiencies in terms of claims not being made where it's clear that that's not going to, someone doesn't meet the eligibility criteria.
Thank you. You then next tell us that paragraph 12, self-isolation payment scheme guidance should include timescales for the issuing of a payment, and monthly reporting data should be published.
Yes, so this is really about the timeliness of payments, self-isolation payments. So experience shows, both during the pandemic and generally in terms of the administration of crisis support for people on low incomes, it's absolutely critical that payments and that financial support is made at the point at which crisis or hardship is experienced. We saw with the administration during the pandemic of self-isolation payments, when there was a high demand on the schemes, the timescales slipped for the issuing of payments, sometimes went beyond 4 weeks. And clearly there, the risk is that people will make alternative arrangements. They might carry on working or not feel they can comply with self-isolation regulations.
Thank you. You then tell us that a communication strategy should be published which clearly indicates eligibility criteria and payment processes. Accessibility and language issues should be fully considered. I think that probably follows on from what you've already said around a self-isolation payment eligibility checker. But do you want to add anything to that recommendation?
I believe that the evidence shows, particularly in England, there was a lack of consideration of equalities issues, and this then feeds into communication plans. So I think there needed to be a much clearer recognition of the marginalised groups who were most likely to qualify for self-isolation support payments. There then needed to be a clear communication strategy that had some consistent messaging, but also then some more bespoke and tailored communications for certain groups. And this needed to take into account issues of digital exclusion, around language, about pushing messages out through employers and through community groups.
Thank you. And so with referencing employers and community groups, are you indicating that they have the role for the bespoke communications?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. You then tell us at paragraph 14 that careful consideration needs to be given to the scheme name for future self-isolation payments, as there was confusion around this and how self-isolation support payments interact with other support.
Yes, so scheme names for social welfare payments is not easy. So in my experience previously working in local government advice services, recipients of social security and social welfare payments often find it really difficult to accurately label the payments that they're receiving. However, there are, I think, there is good practice and poorer practice with that. So, for example, in England, test, trace and support payments, I think, had a very low recognition. Often people would just refer to it as the £500 payment. I think something that actually includes the phrase self-isolation would certainly be preferable to that. And also the scheme name is important because although I've suggested that the self-isolation support payments should be part of a centralised scheme, they do need that distinct branding within that scheme.
Thank you.
So I'm not following what was wrong. Self-isolation did feature support. What's wrong with self-isolation support scheme? Why doesn't that do what it says on the tin?
So it's a good question. So there were 4 different names across the 4 nations. So in England, test, trace and support payments, I think I feel that was less clear than in some of the devolved nations. So, for example, in Scotland, we had the self-isolation support grant. That, to me, is much clearer. So I would use that as an example from Scotland as being much more efficient than the title we had in England.
I follow. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think on that note, each of the devolved nations referenced self-isolation support. You referenced Scotland. Wales was the self-isolation support scheme, and Northern Ireland had the discretionary support self-isolation grant. So I think perhaps you're just really highlighting the fact that England chose not to reference self-isolation. Would that perhaps be fair?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Now, you next tell us at paragraph 15 that in a future pandemic, software applications, central government and/or healthcare systems should include clear information about self-isolation payments and include clear links to claim a payment.
Yes, and that was the case as the pandemic progressed and self-isolation payments became more established. But there were particular issues at the launch of test, trace and support payments in England where there was question marks about the efficiency of central government information and also about whether the official COVID app had clear referrals to test, trace and support payments. So I think it's about getting those communications right at the initial launch of schemes.
And thank you. You've just referenced the COVID app that operated in England and Wales. And so what's the issue you're saying about how that linked with the ability to make a claim under the scheme?
So initially there wasn't a link to make an application for a self-isolation payment. And in the early stages of the pandemic, it then relied on human contact tracers to issue a code to allow people to proceed with a claim for a self-isolation payment. So that automation was missing in the initial stages.
And so in terms of a development of an app, should that have really been at the heart of one of the things that the app enabled? Bearing in mind, I think they operated almost in time. I think the app came online on the 24th of September of 2020. The scheme in the United Kingdom, I think, was also at the end of September. Was it quite a failure then that app rolled out alongside the requirement to isolate that was enforceable should have had a clear link to make an application for an isolation payment?
Absolutely, I think that was a failure, and there were a number of changes to communications and even to the scheme rules, and I think in a future pandemic there needs to be a much clearer communications process and application process right from the launch of schemes.
Thank you. You next has at paragraph 16, in a future pandemic, contact tracers should provide clear signposting to self-isolation payments and other local support for financial hardship. I think that's perhaps self-explanatory, that recommendation. And you then go on, in a future pandemic, full self-isolation payment equality impact assessments should be published in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. Assessments should consider the impact on claimants with protected characteristics as stipulated in the Equality Act 2010. And why do you particularly draw this out? Because I know in the report you referenced, I think, some of the difficulties you had in identifying the impact assessments. Is that correct?
Yes, that's partly correct. So equality impact assessments, which directly related to self-isolation schemes, were completed in England and Scotland. In Wales and Northern Ireland, there were a series of equality impact assessments that were conducted, some of which did look at the issue of self-isolation, but not specifically around self-isolation support payments. It's really important that equality impact assessments are carried out in a comprehensive and robust way in order to identify equalities issues for the rollout of policy, and then to be able to make modifications to policy to ensure that that's fair and equitable. The Scottish equality impact assessment is an example of best practice in that drew on a really wide range of evidence and specifically identified equalities issues for certain groups, for example, people with disabilities, women, children and young people. And then clearly the Scottish Government could point to how their scheme catered for those groups. In England, the Equality Impact Assessment, when it went through the protected characteristics of the Equality Act, simply made an assessment that there were no issues with any of those protected characteristics, which I think was a very incomplete assessment of equalities issues that were at play during the pandemic, risks the assumption that there aren't any equality issues.
Thank you. Now, next, you recommend a consultation exercise should be delivered as soon as is practicable with central and local government stakeholders, the voluntary and third sector and academics, so an agreement in principle or a working framework can be provided for the level of self-isolation payments in a future pandemic.
Yes, so this is connected to the opportunity we now have for future pandemic preparedness to be in a much better position should there be a future pandemic, and that a scheme such as self-isolation payments can be launched in a much more efficient and timely manner. So a consultation exercise would require central and local government stakeholders, Department for Work and Pensions, Treasury, Public Health, academic experts, think tanks, the voluntary sector, and some of the things that it could look at in the non-pandemic period is about the level of payment, different modelling, the level of earnings replacement that self-isolation payments could be set at, and what the implications of those different earnings replacement levels might be. So, for example, should it be set at the real living wage? Should it be set at universal credit levels or universal credit levels plus 25%? Should it be aligned with a future furlough or coronavirus job retention scheme?
So really what you're saying is those discussions informed by what happened in the pandemic can be taking place now to essentially get the model ready to roll out in the event of a future pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think some of those principles can certainly be identified. Different options can be identified. Of course, the detail of the policy would be affected by political and fiscal decisions at the time of any future pandemic. But I think certainly that framework and principles can be established now.
Yeah, so exactly that, a framework in principle.
Yes.
Thank you. And then finally, before we get into some particular detail, please, you say that in a future pandemic, central and devolved governments should publish the policy rationale for the payment level of self-isolation payments and funding to local authorities for wraparound support. And I think we've touched upon those issues in the answers you've given already.
Yes, I guess what I would add is it was striking during the research and completion of the report that it was difficult to penetrate the policy rationale beyond a very headline couple of sentences justifying the development of self-isolation schemes. So certainly very little information around the groups that self-isolation payments were catered for or around the level of payment.
Thank you. Can we then move to some particular questions, and then before we look again at your ultimate conclusion, can we move please to page 11 and paragraph 30? Thank you. And this is under the section where you were dealing with the scheme that operated in England. And you say this: pressure had been building on the United Kingdom government to provide financial support to individuals who were required to self-isolate. A number of local authorities and directors of public health expressed concern that for some residents, financial hardship was having an impact on the ability to self-isolate. Can you assist? Is that a fair interpretation also of your position as expressed in the report?
Yes, so the report details that there was certainly a growing awareness and concern about the lack of financial support during the self-isolation period. as stated there in the report from local authorities and directors of public health, and also community groups, advice agencies, social welfare agencies. So this was, I think, a growing concern in those early months of the pandemic.
Thank you. Can we then next please move to paragraph 82 at page 25? And again, we can see this falls under the topic of self-isolation support payments as part of a broader range of support. You detail the analysis of the role, you deal with the details of the financial support available to those self-isolating and obviously set out the various arguments. And can I ask you, the indication is that there's strong evidence that self-isolation payments should sit alongside other forms of non-financial and practical support, as we've touched on in your recommendations. Are there any other examples of non-financial and practical support that you think should sit alongside financial support?
Yes, and some of this draws on my research based in Nottingham, where local authorities provided support with medicine delivery, with delivery of food, with supporting families with educational resources such as textbooks and support around online learning. Can also include well-being checks. So there's examples of local authorities using helplines for well-being checks, as well as referrals to voluntary and community groups that have got specific functions, perhaps around mental health or community engagement.
Thank you. And I think it perhaps fits with some of the observation and detail you provide in the report, particularly about the schemes as operated in New York, for example.
Yes, that's right. And particularly interesting you mentioned New York. There was the provision of accommodation there, which wasn't part of the schemes in the UK. That hasn't come through as a key issue, but that certainly would be something that could be considered during this period around principles and frameworks, whether that wraparound support perhaps needs to look at accommodation needs.
Thank you. I think I was thinking in particular, I think schemes in New York included dog walking services and the like. Thank you. Can I then ask you, building on that earlier question, do you consider that the policies implemented, funding allocated for forms of non-financial and practical support were sufficient during the pandemic? And I appreciate you need to look at this through a four nations perspective.
Yes, so the research indicates that there was a high level of refusals of self-isolation support payments, and that some local authorities, quite a high percentage, around 25-30% of local authorities in the early stages of the pandemic exhausted funding for self-isolation support payments. There is also, I think, an interesting comparison between England and Wales. So overall, the expenditure on self-isolation support payments in England was around 285 million, and in Wales was around 70 million. So we can see that the scheme in Wales was funded to a high level, and the indications are that that was a much more efficient scheme as well. So trying to draw out some of those financial issues has been quite difficult from the publicly available data. But I would be comfortable in concluding that there was a lack of financial support for local authorities to meet the needs of communities who were self-isolating.
Thank you. Can we then move forward, please, to page 27 in your paragraph 87 under the topic of self-isolation and financial status? You detail that in the early stages of the pandemic, the United Kingdom government made it clear that they wanted to avoid a situation where people didn't feel they're financially able to self-isolate. You then detail that similarly, SAGE stated that providing appropriate financial support was key in encouraging people to self-isolate, and that financial assistance should be provided alongside emotional and practical support. having identified those early statements of intent, are you able to assist as to what, in your opinion, accounted for the late introduction of payment support in the United Kingdom, namely being in September 2020, Scotland being October of 2020, Wales similarly October 2020, and obviously Northern Ireland introduced their discretionary scheme in March of 2020?
I think there was a number of factors that contributed to the delays in scheme launches. I think, firstly, it is not straightforward to deliver this sort of social welfare payment at speed, and there are challenges with that. I think also there was a connection between the developing regulations, legal obligation to self-isolate, and for financial payment, which perhaps didn't start right at the beginning of the payment. So there was some alignment between financial support and those legal obligations. But I think overall there was this growing sense of pressure that the government felt, and growing evidence that people on low incomes, one of the factors in non-adherence to self-isolation was financial hardship.
Thank you. And can I ask you, I appreciate that you had information provided you by the inquiry. Have you been able to follow any of the evidence in the inquiry, particularly Baroness Harding's evidence about the efforts that she was making to try and get a self-isolation scheme and payments there? Have you?
Yes, so I'm aware that there were certainly those high-level conversations at an early stage that financial support was seen as absolutely critical. So certainly arguments that should have fed into policy at an earlier stage.
Thank you. Can we then please move to your paragraph 111 at page 31, please? And this is under your heading of COVID-19 experiences for excluded groups. You specifically reference a study in Wales by Isherwood et al. That found that financial challenges associated with self-isolation were particularly severe for people with high income precarity, women and younger people. Can you comment on the ability of these groups to self-isolate given the severe financial challenges?
So this piece of research has identified those particular groups as having additional challenges. So it's often related for those three groups, high income precarity, women and younger people, around the employment type. So being in care work, hospitality, leisure, where there were typically in low-paid jobs that might have stayed open during the pandemic. For women, particular issues around often low wages, part-time work, and combining employment with caring roles. And for younger people, often again overrepresented in those employment types where there is low pay. For younger people, often have a high percentage of their income spent on accommodation and rely on a lower level often of wages and social security support. And also for all of those groups, there is a relationship with statutory sick pay. So 2 million of the lowest paid workers in the UK are not entitled to statutory sick pay, clearly creating pressures during the self-isolation period, and those groups would be overrepresented in those statistics of people not entitled to statutory sick pay.
Thank you. And I think an observation has been made similarly for those categories. That would apply principally also to a large proportion of social care workers who often are women on low incomes. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yes.
Can I next ask your assistance, please, with some of the graphs that you've provided? If we start at page 38, please, under the heading of the adequacy and scope of the self-isolation support grant in Scotland. So it's page 38, just to orientate ourselves. And if we go on to the next page, please, can you just just in simple terms, assist us first of all with what you're showing us on this figure at page 39, please, in respect of the operation of the scheme in Scotland.
Yes, so this indicates the number of applications over time for the self-isolation support grant in Scotland. So really the commentary that goes along with this is that we can see in the early phases of the rollout of the grant, so it actually was rolled out from October 2020. There was a fairly low number of claims in that initial period, and that is thought to be around low public awareness of the scheme. We can then see there's a number of spikes or increases in the number of claims to the scheme. This is in part that the Scottish Government made some changes to widen the eligibility criteria for the grant. So in December 2020, extended eligibility criteria to include people isolating where a child or young person had needed to self-isolate. And then in February 2021, there was an extension to the eligibility criteria to include people whose income went up to the real living wage. So there was those changes in the eligibility criteria that created a more generous scheme or comprehensive scheme that accounted for some of those spikes. And then we can also see in September 2001 and then in January 2022, those really clear links between transmission rates through the Delta and Omicron variants and number of claims for self-isolation payments.
Thank you. And then can we go over the page again, just perhaps...
Sorry, just before you move on, remembering, as you may not know, that I'm not that good with graphs, you say changing the eligibility criteria in early 2021 and February 2021 led to spikes. But in fact, the graphs seem to show that the claimants went down until June 21. So
I think maybe that's linked to perhaps time lags in terms of public awareness. The Scottish Government did disseminate quite a lot of information around the grant, so I think that we can perhaps see that time lag in terms of change in eligibility and then claims following from that.
Thank you. Can we then go over the page, please? And you've, again, on the table at figure 3, give some detail about the applications process. Could you again just summarise what this position helps us understand relating to the scheme as it operated in Scotland?
Yes, so we've already discussed the importance of the timeliness of payments, and what this is indicating, it hasn't got the dates here, but the commentary to go with that is that during the periods of peak demand for the scheme in Scotland, the processing times became longer. So in that peak that we saw in the previous graph in January 2022, for example, we've got over half of the claims at that point in time were taking more than 28 days to process. So there's those clear links between the pressures on the scheme and the number of applications and an increase in the processing timescales.
Thank you. And can we then go to the paragraph that sits below that, paragraph 150, please? You say that in a future pandemic, it's important that self-isolation payment schemes are robust enough to cope with changing increased demands and that appropriately trained staff are available to process claims. Could you assist, please, as to what measures should be adopted to improve robustness of the self-isolation payment schemes?
This, I think, links to the earlier question about sufficient funding. So the evidence from Scotland indicates that during those peak pressures on the self-isolation support grant, there were capacity issues in a local authority. There were, of course, that was combined with staff absence in the local authority. So I think this is an opportunity, again, in this period to do some modelling around the extent of the number of claims and capacity requirements to actually deliver those, both in terms of IT systems, but particularly in terms of workforce and personnel.
Thank you. Can we next move, please, to page 42, just to orientate ourselves with where we are in the report. So we're now under the heading of adequacy and scope of the self-isolation support scheme in Wales. And having located ourselves, can we then move to your paragraph 168, which is on page 44? Now, thank you. You note that the value to qualitative research from Wales, but then go on to state that detailed quantitative analysis based on local authority data is not available. And then in the following on paragraph, you highlight the limitations to the research given the small scale and reliance on self-reported information. Can you assist, please, as to why quantitative data from Welsh local authorities was not available for consideration, and assist at all on what research should have been undertaken to avoid the limitations you've identified?
Yes, so I think there are two elements to this. During the completion of the report, across all 4 nations, there was a lack of quantitative data relating to the number of claims over a month-on-month period, the number of refusals, the expenditure on a month-by-month basis, and how that was linked to COVID transmission rates. So I think that's the first element, that in a future pandemic, there needs to be much clearer and robust monthly quantitative reporting on the administration of the scheme. The second element about the qualitative data, some of the qualitative research actually in Wales is clearer and more detailed than in the other nations of the UK. However, it still was small in scale, and so I would suggest that in a future pandemic we would need to have much more rapid qualitative analysis of the experience of people claiming self-isolation support payments, particularly around seldom heard groups, and also around research for local authority decision makers and people who chose not to self-isolate for financial reasons. So I think it's a combination of both that, certainly lack of official quantitative monitoring and data, and a more comprehensive range of qualitative research.
Thank you. Now, can we go back a page, please, to paragraph 163? Thank you, which again just gives some context again in Wales, because we know Wales was the only of the 4 nations that for a short period increased the payment schemes to £750. But you detail that more than 50% of respondents who received the initial £500 payment stated that they'd lost income as a result of self-isolation, and then go on to say that for respondents who received the £750 payment, which was increased obviously from the 9th of August 2021, just under 25% reported that they'd lost income as a result of self-isolation. Now then, can I just seek your comments then on the figures that were arrived at, and will you just bear with me while I give you some context to this question. First of all, we can see that in the report, when there were the pilot schemes initially, I think that operated in Blackburn and Pendle, there was schemes had a £13 per day allocation of support initially. And then we know latterly that the Westminster government arrived at the figure of £500 for financial support, and plainly that applied whether the isolation period was 14, 10 days or latterly 7 days. Are you able to assist as to how the Westminster government arrived at that £500 figure?
There isn't a clear policy statement or intent on how the Westminster government did conclude the £500 payment was appropriate.
Now, we've looked at the figure in Wales where the increased payment threshold was introduced. But then can you assist, because you've had provided in your pack, and we'll briefly look at it, please, the statement of Mr. York-Smith on behalf of the Treasury, please. And can we briefly go to INQ 587305 at paragraph 148, where we see the analysis there as to the Treasury officials in November 2020 noting in advice that when it was first introduced, the £500 payment was intended to support isolators for a 14-day period, equating to £35.71 per day, or 82% of the national living wage rate at that time. Noting as we have, as the lead up to this question, the actions of the Welsh Government, you've also detailed the fact that SAGE and other organisations criticise the level of financial support payment in England. Are you able to assist as to whether the Westminster Government ever reviewed the level of financial support and considered increasing it?
So we can see from the evidence on screen that there was consideration of that initial £500 payment. I've not reviewed any evidence that suggests that was reviewed on an ongoing basis. Interestingly, in Wales, when the payment was increased to £750 in August of 2021, there was a consultation exercise in order to make that policy decision, and that also considered the fact that at that point in time it was the ending of the coronavirus job retention scheme the following month, and also in the following month, in September 21, was the upgrading of universal credit was finishing. So there's a clear example from Wales there of consideration of overall societal circumstances, which I haven't been able to find from the Westminster Government.
Thank you. And then can we briefly then go back to page 43 in your report at paragraph 163, where you have detailed the statistics as to what effect the £750 payment had. Thank you. You conclude that paragraph by saying increased payments were amongst the recommendations from participants for scheme improvement.
I think the level of payment is clearly a political and fiscal decision, and there is actually a lack of clear research around an investigation around the level of payment. You mentioned earlier in the context of the question that in pilot areas in Lancashire there was a £13 a day payment. That has been analysed, and there is some quite clear conclusions that level of payment was inadequate and led to a really low take-up. I believe only 12 or 13 people actually claimed during that pilot period. Overall, what I think is absolutely clear is that people are more likely to self-isolate where there's a higher level of earnings replacement. So if we wanted a gold-plated system, then self-isolation payments which replaced earnings like for like, I think would be the most successful, but clearly that's got massive budgetary implications. This research that's on screen now is interesting, that this does indicate that for people on low incomes, the self-isolation payments in Wales weren't covering the full costs incurred by self-isolation. So again, there are, we have to think, to what extent does that create a risk that some people will choose not to self-isolate and maybe continue to work?
I appreciate the logic of increase the financial support and you're more likely to get adherence to self-isolation policies. Wales increased it to £750. Do we have the hard evidence that improved adherence?
Not that I've seen, no. So, and I think that's part of the challenge I've had with the report is drawing on lots of different sources of information. Some of that is speculative. So certainly my recommendations, and we discussed this a few moments ago, about the need for that robust information, about quantitative monitoring on a monthly basis, and those links to transmission rates, that doesn't exist. So.
Thank you. Can I then, just building on those general topics, have you any views as to whether the policy of England, Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland was most effective as financial support for those isolating? Is there a view as to which of the schemes was better?
So, as you mentioned at the beginning of the questions, within the report there is a detailed analysis of some of the merits and limitations of the schemes. As an indicator of that, the scheme in Wales supported around 111,000 people at a cost of 70 million. And if we just take those headline figures, that was a more comprehensive scheme than we saw certainly in England, where we've got around 285 million for 570,000 claimants, or in Scotland, where the overall expenditure was 70 million. And certainly the evidence indicates that in Wales, that did create scheme efficiencies. There was a lower level of refusals of the payment, and we had a huge postcode lottery in England based on local authority administration that was largely avoided in Wales. So we've talked a lot about scheme rules, about communication, about wraparound support, but the effectiveness and efficiency of the schemes is really connected to the budget that supports that, both for staffing and then issuing of payments. And of those schemes, the indications are that Wales had efficiencies.
Thank you. And then can I ask you as a general proposition, we know that the discretionary scheme was introduced in March of 2020 in Northern Ireland, and the policies in England and Wales came on later, and Scotland also. Does that reflect an issue of inadequate preparation in your view?
Yeah, so interesting, Northern Ireland had quite a different scheme, which the grants available in Northern Ireland were available not only for people who were self-isolating, but effectively as a cost of living payment for people who were affected by COVID-19 and suffered financial hardship. Northern Ireland made a decision to go very early with that scheme and to use the existing discretionary support scheme that they had, which is a scheme that provides emergency payments. So there were some merits in using those existing systems, and that allowed Northern Ireland to roll that out more quickly. But I think thinking about future pandemic preparedness, there is enough evidence and learning from the COVID-19 pandemic that these schemes could be rolled out at a much earlier stage.
Thank you. Can we then briefly touch upon an issue of accessibility? Your paragraph 193, please, on page 50. You, in the context of Wales, talk about accessibility issues, and a common concern within Wales has been written communications provided by the Welsh Government being interchangeable to either Welsh or English language that made comprehension difficult. Are you able to assist as to whether similar issues were experienced with the information provided about the scheme as operated in Wales?
So some of the qualitative research indicates that participants did find that the online information was difficult to understand. That sometimes was connected to the requirements to provide evidence for claims, and that people weren't clear about what the eligibility criteria for the scheme was, and the evidence that they would need to provide in order to support a claim. And I think in terms of broader accessibility issues, there is a lack of consistency between central and local government information, but I think also sometimes a lack of tailored communications for people maybe who have communication issues or perhaps aren't digitally literate and wouldn't be able to access online information.
Thank you. Now, can we move next to a brief topic, please, on international comparators? Can we turn to page 70 first to orientate ourselves, where we can see this paragraph I'm about to take you to falls under the topic of the provision of statutory sick pay compared to sick leave payments in other countries. And then can we move to paragraph 274 and 275, please? You detail that TUC Cymru argue that there's a correlation between countries with the best track record in self-isolation adherence and high levels of statutory sick leave payment schemes, citing New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore and South Korea as indicative examples. And you go on to say there appears to be merit to these claims, but a higher level of analysis, ideally by an economic think tank or academic institution ahead of any future pandemic, would be required to establish a firm link between sick leave payments and self-isolation adherence in the countries referenced above. A broader range of factors beyond provision of sick pay, e.g. cultural norms, pandemic legislation and surveillance measures, would need to be considered alongside analysis of sick pay provisions. Are you able to assist, or are you aware of whether any further comparative analysis work on this topic has been undertaken?
At the time of writing the report, I don't believe so. My summary of those two paragraphs would be there is a logic and merit to what's stated in paragraph 274 about those correlations. I think a comparative exercise between the UK and other countries is really difficult. I think overall it is fair to say that in the UK, the provision of statutory sick pay is less comprehensive than in many other comparative countries, certainly European countries. So I think that the restrictions on statutory sick pay created financial hardship in the pandemic that was more pronounced in the UK than many other countries. To then try and tease out some of these particular comparisons, I think is difficult because of those factors that are indicated on screen, and we would have to know about wage levels in those countries, other social protection schemes. One of the really key findings from the section of the report that deals with international comparison is in countries which have a more comprehensive and adequate social protection system, the reliance on bespoke self-isolation payments is much lower. So, for example, in Germany and Sweden, effectively the governments there didn't need to bolt on self-isolation payments in the way that we needed to in the UK, because the existing protections were considered adequate to compensate people during the self-isolation period.
Thank you. And then finally, please, can we move to your overall conclusion at page 93? And Professor Machin, this overall conclusion comes after where you've given a much more detailed analysis of the recommendations at pages 83 to 94 that essentially build on what we've already dealt with in the first portion of our discussion this morning. But you say this as to your overall conclusion. This report has demonstrated that there are clear links between the ability to self-isolate and financial status. The self-isolation schemes analysed in this report were introduced in recognition of the risks that people will not self-isolate because of financial hardship. This report finds that self-isolation schemes with high levels of earning replacement are more likely to encourage self-isolation compliance. Where a substantial financial loss is incurred because of the need to self-isolate, there is a real risk of non-adherence without comprehensive financial support from the government. And so can I ask you, in light of that particular finding, would you agree that resilience planning should have included financial payment support to be rolled out as part of the early pandemic response when isolation measures were imposed?
So certainly the research and conclusions of the report are that self-isolation and adherence to self-isolation is intrinsically linked to people's financial circumstances. And so although it's really clear that financial support needs to be provided as an overall package of support that we've discussed, I believe it should have been, people's financial status should have been given a high level of prominence and earlier recognition in the pandemic response.
Thank you. And then, again, building on that, looking forward, do you consider that there is evidence of sufficient commitment from government and those in authority that this must now form a central part of resilience planning?
So the evidence presented is overwhelming in terms of the links between self-isolation and financial support. What we have now is an opportunity to take this learning for central government stakeholders, Department for Work and Pensions, HMRC, the Treasury, to actually reflect on the learning from COVID-19 and in a future pandemic to have in place systems which are ready to be delivered right from the start of a pandemic, communication plans that are very clear, that have clear equalities, issues running through them, and that we now have the opportunity for a reflective exercise to look at some of those issues, particularly around level of payment.
Thank you. Can we then go over the page, please, to your paragraph 339? You also conclude that your report has demonstrated that the pandemic created particular financial and self-isolation challenges for certain groups, including women, young people, those in precarious work and people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And you say this, despite this, equalities monitoring of self-isolation schemes was inadequate, particularly in England.
Yes, so this relates to the completion of the Equalities Impact Assessment in England that concluded there was no specific impact on any protected characteristic. And that simply isn't the findings of my report. That isn't my experience in the sector and isn't supported by the evidence that I've drawn on for this report.
Thank you. We then briefly look at the next paragraph. You also detail that there was a lack of transparency, particularly in England, about the policy rationale to determine the payment level of self-isolation support.
Yes, so certainly from the publicly available documents, there was a lack of a clear rationale for the £500 payment, and this wasn't something that was monitored or reviewed as the pandemic endured.
Thank you. Can I ask you, would you agree it would be of considerable value to share your conclusions with government bodies?
Yes, absolutely.
And then just finally, perhaps just building on the question asked by her ladyship, you answered the question that there's no firm evidence that increased payments in Wales supported adherence to self-isolation. Are you able to assist us as to what evidence there is?
So the qualitative report that specifically deals with different experience of a £500 payment in Wales and £750 payment in Wales does indicate that people felt more able and equipped to deal with a reduced loss of income. So I think the evidence is not clear as more anecdotal, but I think the anecdotal evidence is there.
And then can I ask you, are you able to, beyond the anecdotal evidence, assist as to why there is no firm evidence?
So I think that relates back to our earlier discussion around a lack of robust monitoring. And it's really been difficult to interrogate the administration of the schemes in a very detailed way. So that month-on-month reporting, links to transmission rates, looking at local communities, number of claims, number of refusals, expenditure. That's been really difficult to interrogate in that granular level.
Thank you. Professor Machin, those are my questions.
I have no further questions. Professor, thank you very much indeed for your help. I'm very grateful for your very thoughtful analysis of the problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. I shall return at 11:25.
Thank you.
All rise.
Thank you, my lady. Please could Professor Pillay be sworn?
If you'd like to repeat after me, I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I should give
shall be the truth,
should be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please sit down.
Professor Pillay, our final witness for these hearings. But I gather it wasn't deliberately chosen you should be last. It was because you've been away, I gather. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you. Could you please give your full name to the inquiry?
Yes, Dean and Pillay, Professor Dean and Pillay.
Thank you. Professor Pillay, can we please display your witness statement first of all, and then move to page 11. It's a statement dated the 25th of February of this year. Can I ask you to confirm are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Indeed, yes.
Thank you. Can we then, first of all, briefly introduce you and your expertise? It's right, isn't it, that you, whilst retired now, are a medical virologist?
That's right.
And can you give us some idea as to your career as a medical virologist and how long you practiced before your retirement?
Of course, I trained postgraduately after medical school in virology. I took up my first consultant post in the early 90s in Birmingham, working for the Public Health Laboratory Service at that time. And then after 10 years, I ran a reference laboratory for antiviral drug resistance, a national laboratory. I then moved to University College London, where I took on an academic position as well as working as a consultant at University College Hospital. And I became professor there in the mid-2000s, 2007 or so. And I've carried on my research as well as clinical activities. My research has been predominantly on HIV, therapies of HIV. And latterly, I then moved, seconded to run a Wellcome Trust-funded research centre in rural South Africa, which is an HIV and TB research centre from which I returned in 2019, just before the COVID pandemic. And I've been working more in the context of involvement in Independent SAGE and within the Clinical Virology Network from that time until my retirement in 2022.
Thank you. Now, in addition to your role as a clinical virologist and an academic, it's right, isn't it, that you are a member of the Clinical Virology Network?
That's right.
We'll come on to deal with that in a moment. Between 2020 and 2022, you were a member of the MHRA Expert Working Group on COVID Therapeutics.
That's right.
You are also a member of the Department of Health and Social Care's Horizon Scanning Group for new COVID diagnostics in 2020.
That's right.
Can you just give a brief summary about that Horizon Scanning Group, please?
Certainly. There was a complex set of structures developed, I think, under the Cabinet Office with regard to new diagnostics, both identifying new diagnostics, sourcing new diagnostics, and the role that I had was chairing a Horizon Scanning group to look at the data on both suppliers as well as their, obviously, the diagnostics they were supplying, the quality of those, and indeed to identify what the best way was to evaluate them, and then moving through the MHRA process for approval.
Thank you. Now, in addition, it's right, isn't it, you were a member of the Serology Diagnostic Task Force, which was the Scientific Advisory Committee in 2020.
That's right.
And you also sat on the governance committee of the COVID Genomics UK from 2020 to 2022.
That's right.
And you've already identified that you were a member of Independent Sage, and you give us some detail about your involvement in the work of Independent Sage in the pandemic. So can I start first of all? I think you're the first virologist that we've heard evidence from this inquiry. It may be a pretty basic and obvious thing, but can you first of all describe why a virologist, that expertise is so important in a pandemic, but also what a virologist does and why it was so important to what was needed in the pandemic?
Of course, I'll be as brief as I can. Consultant virologists are in the main medically qualified, but can also be scientifically qualified to become consultant clinical scientists responsible for leading and running diagnostic laboratories. Their responsibilities of a consultant clinical virologist include testing, treatment of and prevention of viral infections of clinical consequence. Increasingly, they work within larger teams, if in hospitals, for instance, with infectious diseases, consultants, microbiologists, infection control. They can be employed by the NHS, therefore by UK HSA and its predecessors, Public Health England, as well as universities, and work. There are something like 49 what we call specialist virology units around the United Kingdom and Ireland. All of those are consultant-led, and that represents the clinical virology network. Just briefly, a key component, almost a given for clinical virologists, is to evaluate new tests for viruses that emerge or existing viruses that need diagnosis, to identify when tests should be done, how best to advise others on management of patients with those, or see patients ourselves with those, and liaise with other hospital consultants, GPs, and directors of public health and their teams. And therefore, implicit in all the work we do is all the components of that of that cascade, as it were, of getting samples in, making sure the right samples are taken through to the data linkages and advice. And just finally, to put it into context, since I went to university, on average, there's been one new virus infecting humans identified per year. So there's always new viruses coming up. And with each of those viruses, whether they cause chronic infection or lifelong infection or acute infection, such as COVID, these same challenges exist. What best tests? How do we evaluate tests? How do we develop tests through to treatment and vaccination, prevention, and dealing with the consequences? And I should say that since I was first to medical school, HIV and hepatitis C have been identified, and we've just had another public inquiry dealing with the consequences of them 50 years or 40 years later. So how we deal with these viruses now also has consequences for the long term.
Thank you. Now, in answering that question, you've identified the importance of a virology to a pandemic response, and you've set out that there was in the clinical virology network essentially 49 centres that existed in the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We're going to be looking in due course at some letters that were sent or evidence, which has, along with you as a signatory, 69 other consultant virologists that were raising concerns about the lack of use of the clinical virology network. That's my summary. Would you agree that
Yes,
that's what the
correct.
letters reflect?
That's correct.
Now, in terms of what you've said clinical virologists do day in, day out, it's essentially to deal with viruses, but also the public health response. Would you agree?
That's right.
And that the clinical virology network is connected to health protection teams,
Yes.
public health and the associate directors of public health.
Yes.
And then you've raised about your role with data. Can you assist those laboratories, the 49 that are part of the clinical virology network, Is there a linkage that existed at the time of the pandemic for having got the test to then get the results onto the patient record and to the GP?
Of course, there's been obviously much development of data systems linking different components of the health service. But implicit in what we do and our laboratories do is direct electronic transfer of data. We don't do that by paper, and now the systems are very well developed for getting data to where it needs to be. But obviously, within hospital systems, that's a given because we'd all be part of the hospital network. But with primary care, that's now the case, as well as public health consultants, directors of public health, and their teams, particularly, of course, where the testing we do relates to outbreaks of whatever virus is going on and needs that input from those public health officials.
Thank you. So from your perspective, the clinical virology network, if scaled up in the pandemic, could have got the test results directly into the patient and GP records?
Yes.
Now, can I ask you additionally then, just because you're an individual that's visited these labs throughout your career, the letters that you have sent that we'll look at, that were sent to the relevant individuals in government, did not have a response, you tell us in the witness statement. And certainly it was identifying this capacity that existed in the clinical virology network. We heard some evidence from Mr. Hancock that effectively they looked everywhere, they looked at the laboratories, and they were not fit for the purpose that was needed in the pandemic. Are you able to assist as to whether, to the best of your knowledge, the laboratories that Mr. Hancock visited included the clinical virology network?
No, I listened with interest to his answers to your questions in this module. I think it's a given that these 70 clinical virologists representing 49 laboratories across the UK, so including devolved nations and Ireland, the fact that they've written letters both in July, I think one of them, and the other is in October 2020, the fact that they've written these letters, it's self-evident that they felt that they were not involved and not been their advice had not been sought with regard to scaling up capacity for COVID testing.
Thank you. Well, perhaps we'll just briefly look at these letters together now and then go through your statement, please. Can we first of all go to a letter that was sent on the 10th of July 2020, which is INQ 551844. That's 551844. Thank you. We can see this is the letter sent on behalf of the Clinical Virology Network of the 10th of July 2020 to Professor Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Joe Martin. If we go over the page, please, to page 2, we see the start of the list of the names of the consultant virologists and their locations. And again, go to page 3. Thank you. Again, so identifying location and specialty. And I think it numbers, as you said, the 70 consultants that were located at the 49 laboratories. So can we then go back to page 1, please? And we can see that the letter detailed the concern of the clinical virologists, the lack of engagement by policymakers with clinical virology expertise in the United Kingdom in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. You detail this. Our skills have been underused and underrepresented, albeit to differing extents within the devolved nations of the United Kingdom, resulting in lost opportunities to establish a coordinated, robust and durable testing framework for SARS-CoV-2. And then it details what the professionals have offered expertise in, and then go on to make recommendations that what should be facilitated in terms of the emergency discussion with specialist virology centres over the page, rollout of validated RNA PCR assays, a testing strategy to be coordinated, and then again in the next paragraph, please, detailing we work as a network and offer to help with planning for and dealing with any subsequent waves of infection. We can enable better communication and collaboration between major institutions, PHE, NHS, the Royal College of Pathology, provided there is increased representation of clinical virology expertise on appropriate policy-making bodies. We are ideally placed to understand what is achievable with current infrastructure and staffing, and to advise on the investments in people and facilities needed now to prepare for the upcoming challenges of this and future pandemics. In addition, we are well placed to promote and disseminate advice and guidance using our established professional networks to facilitate rapid adoption. And then in the next paragraph, essentially reference the work that had been done in 2009 on the influenza pandemic. And so again, we've explored with a number of witnesses what would have or could have been possible by way of scale up of differing laboratories that existed. And are you able to give some assistance? That letter referenced the existing infrastructure that did exist. What's your views and opinion as to how the virology network could have been scaled up for the testing that was needed?
So I've outlined earlier what our sort of bread and butter function is, which includes all aspects of from sampling through to data transfer, including, of course, testing. And it struck me, listening to actually others in this module, the degree to which almost people involved in testing early on at government level were discovering for the first time that you needed to consider how samples were transferred, how tests could be undertaken, how data could be transferred, and indeed what was needed in order to make sure that the impact of those tests on the person at the end of the line was enacted. So, first of all, was that experience and that understanding could have, I think, bypassed many of the problems there were early on. Secondly, and of course I accept that with the scale of tests needed, there would always have had to be new infrastructure built and developed. But had that been done on the back of those systems, with the same ownership of those systems, then I think we would have we would have been far more effective, far earlier in maximising the utility of testing for the benefit of both those who had COVID, but also to prevent further infections.
And so in terms of the scale-up of testing that the inquiries heard evidence that was needed, are you saying, first of all, in the existing capacity as was, the testing could have been substantially increased across the network?
I think that would need to be on a case-by-case basis, but a question early on could have been put to these specialist laboratories. What other facilities are needed? What partnerships you have? As an example, Paul Nurse talking about the link between my hospital and the CRIC in terms of upscaling testing. There were many, and we've heard from Professor McNally as well, similarly. So there would have been lots of opportunities, and that would be then a place for further investment where that could actually dramatically increase the capacity. So number one. And number two, I think even existing capacity was not utilised fully.
Thank you. And so is it really saying that there was a lost opportunity to build on the existing infrastructure in the clinical virology network?
Well, I think it's not only a lost opportunity, but what I've said in my statement, which I have to say is shameful, is that the huge investment that went in to the new structures means that we've been left with nothing. You know, there literally is no legacy of that. Whereas had investment been made into existing partnerships, then of course we would still have that capacity for now and for future.
Thank you. Can we then just briefly look at, I think, an expansion on this earlier letter that was then sent by way of the written evidence from November of 2020, please? And can we go to INQ 474853? Thank you. So again, this is a submission broadly by the same consultant clinical virologist, and we're in November now. And is it right, the significance of November 2020 is this is at a time after the the new NIHP had been introduced in the August of 2020. And I think it was the frustration, again, if we look at the document, that the fact that, again, a new health protection body had been created, which was then scrapped and became UKHSA, where, again, the virologist network had not been consulted about that new health protection body. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so if we go through, again, you summarise essentially, if we go through the first couple of pages, what was said in the earlier letter. And then on the next page, at page 3, please, you again, you recommend again what's necessary. Thank you. If we can move then to page 4, you say at the bottom of that paragraph, the letter outlined our view that the establishment phase of the NIHP was the ideal opportunity to build a new relationship with the clinical virology community of the UK. We work as a network and offered to help with planning for and dealing with any subsequent waves of infection. Moreover, the NHS and academic associated laboratories include most of our members, and our membership of the Royal College of Pathologists enables rapid and functional communication and collaboration between these institutions. Over the page, please. You then also highlight that focusing testing in the Lighthouse laboratories rather than funding expansion of those existing and experienced NHS laboratories would have been able to assist with the large-scale testing. And so can I ask you, this is November of 2020. We know that there were then subsequent waves of the coronavirus, the second wave that came in the autumn of 2020. Do you have a view as to whether, if there had been consultation with the Clinical Virology Network earlier on, that was an opportunity also for the network to have essentially put plans in place that could have prevented the second wave of the coronavirus?
I certainly think that a more coordinated testing environment would have mitigated some of that growth of of that wave. Of course, it'd be foolish for me to say prevented that at all. But I think the convening power of this network, and as we've learned during, again, this module, as I've learned listening to witnesses, is the silos that exist between NHS and with UK HSA have meant that there's not been the ability, I think, to maximise the potential of this network.
Thank you. And then can we go to page 6, please, which gives the conclusion, again, supported by the names over the page as well of those consultant virologists. You say this: we feel that if the Clinical Virology Network and the associated NHS and university laboratories had been involved from March, the capacity for testing and tracing would have been increased and improved from a regional perspective. This would have been augmented by liaising, collaborating and sharing experience with both validating tests and equipment with the Lighthouse laboratories. This would have offered local mass testing as well as regional and national mass testing in a standardised way, involving professional networks in the NHS, PHE and public health. The opportunity to notify infections and act on those results locally, regionally and nationally together with the public health teams would have helped the test and trace strategy.
That's completely correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we then work through your statement together, please? If we can please go to INQ 475152. And if we could go to paragraph 9, please, on page 3. You deal with the purpose of testing and say this: a diagnostic test only has value if there's clear reason for undertaking it and an action which will follow on from the result. It is this purpose which is key and will define the effectiveness of a testing strategy. I think that's perhaps self-explanatory, but I think you've produced a document today, I think, again, to address some of the evidence we've heard, for example, from Sir Paul Nurse, that gave an example of it's not just about numbers and the fascination of getting to that 100,000 tests figure. Are you able to assist as to any views you have about that as an approach to the strategy that was implemented?
Yes. I'm pleased to. The purpose of mass testing, I mean, well, let's put three reasons for testing for COVID. First of all, if someone is ill and there needs to be a diagnosis so that individual can be managed appropriately with their illness. Secondly, for someone to themselves isolate in order to stop spreading that virus to others. And thirdly, for contacts of those individuals to identify whether they themselves have been infected and therefore can isolate. So for that mass testing part, the second part of what I've said, the aim is to reduce transmission of infection. That should be that's the aim, and any strategy should be measured as an outcome measure of how many infections have been averted. In the same way, for instance, that imaging for and scans for cancer diagnosis, one wouldn't say the target is X number of scans. The target is how many cases of cancer have been caught early, therefore treated effectively or averted, and that should have been the purpose here. So focusing on a number of tests in that context is pretty meaningless unless there's a well thought out way in which that's come up. I suspect, and as we've heard, that this was more of a political statement to garner activity within those who were setting up laboratories, but I don't think it engendered the sort of trust of the population that is required, and as we've learnt, has been central to willingness to be tested and willingness to isolate and therefore limit infection transmission.
Thank you. I think you've alerted the inquiry today to a response letter from Sir David Norgrove to Mr Hancock from May of 2020. Can we briefly look at that? It's INQ 237412. And it's right, isn't it, that Sir David Norgrove identify his role within the UK Statistics Authority.
Chair of the UK.
Thank you.
Authority.
And if we go over the page, please, I think essentially this is really commenting upon the figure of the amount of tests that's being put in the public domain, including the data around COVID-19 are inevitably complex, which makes it more important that publication should meet the standards set by the Code of Practice for Statistics. We urge government to update the COVID-19 national testing strategy to show more clearly how targets are being defined, measured and reported. Measurements will no doubt need to change and develop as we move into new phases for tackling the pandemic. And so can you assist as to why in particular you wanted to bring this document to the attention of the inquiry today?
Well, if you don't mind me saying, I listened earlier to the module where you asked Mr Hancock precisely this, and you quoted my report in asking him that question about the rationale for 100,000 tests. Mr Hancock responded robustly about why it was appropriate. So I wanted just to illustrate that it's not just my opinion. This is the UK Statistics Authority also bringing doubt into that logic.
Thank you. Can we then go to your paragraph 11, please, at 475152? You essentially detailed that a testing strategy needs to be assimilated into the pathway to effect an appropriate outcome and talk about data capture, linkage and accessibility, but also why then Independent Sage in particular says it needed to be a fine test, trace, isolate and support system. Can I then ask you, in the context of the importance of data capture, linkage and accessibility for a successful testing strategy, and I think noting what you do in the statement and other documents about the poor degree of linkage of tests undertaken in private laboratories to NHS records, and reporting back being identified by you as a problem in the pandemic, are you able to assist as to whether, to your knowledge, the problem resolved satisfactorily during the course of the pandemic?
I think it took a long time for data, particularly from lighthouse laboratories, to make its way into those that needed it. And I think what's well recognised is, and I think I referred to in the document, is an outbreak in Leicester where local public health officials found it difficult to access those data, even though the data existed and others within the system could see what was happening in Leicester. The people who actually needed it were not able to obtain it. I should also say, and it's another, if I can relate to another document, the Delve document, which is a Royal Society report quite early on in the process, which did identify that the speed with which from time of swab through to result coming back was central to the effectiveness of an isolation approach.
Can we then briefly look at that Delve report, please, which is INQ 194035. That's INQ 194035, thank you. And is what you're referencing here, this second paragraph where we see, based on our modelling work, we find that adding TTI to a broader package of interventions can generate a reduction of 5 to 15% in the number of new infections, and then talking about the need to essentially reduce, and I think the reduction here is from 5 days to 3 days, saying being necessary.
That's correct. What this report, which was a modelling report, a modelling paper, but did suggest that by reducing the time, this is the time from someone donating a sample and that result getting back to them, if that was reduced from 5 days to 3 days, that could increase the effectiveness of the isolation strategy by 60%. So clearly, days matter in this, and then any data linkage problems will contribute to a delay.
Thank you. And can I ask you, in terms of then what we've already discussed around the clinical virology network, are those essentially the knowledge and the speed of from testing to results something that was part of the functioning of a clinical virology network?
That's quite right, because we're embedded within those data linkages. Now, even if there needed to be new data links developed in respect to the developments of further infection control structures in the midst of a pandemic, the framework would have been there to develop that. All the agreements in terms of data sharing and compatibility of data systems would have been there. So the development work would be far less than I think was required in setting up the Lighthouse laboratories as independent structures.
Thank you. Can we then move to your witness statement again, please, and paragraph 18, which is at page 5 of INQ 475152. You provide there a summary of the test and trace response. You characterise it as confused, uncoordinated approach, which lacks strategy and clear leadership, and quickly focused on test number, rather than ensuring that testing could lead to the goal of reducing disease and ongoing transmission. Further, the urgent need to scale up testing within this framework was severely compromised by not taking advantage of existing laboratories, expertise and well-developed systems. Can you assist to what extent did the emphasis on scale rather than targeted strategic testing obscure the specific needs of those most exposed to infection risk?
Well, I think it was a confused approach. There was lacking of strategy, and when I'm talking about strategy, is not number of tests, but I'm thinking rather the overall goal of the pandemic response. I don't doubt that there needed to be a dramatic increase in capacity for testing. But I say again that if that had been developed on the back of existing structures and expertise and understanding, then the effectiveness of that upscaling would have been much more.
Thank you. And can you assist in terms of a strategic focus? Have you any views as to whether the testing system designed recognised and responded to occupational and structural inequalities faced by ethnic minority healthcare workers?
Well, it's pretty much a given in the NHS, and I say this now, I have retired, I'm a non-executive director on a couple of NHS trusts, and any new service that is developed first goes through the lens of how is this addressing the inequality of access to healthcare that exists. And so that would be a prerequisite for development of any particularly sampling strategy, how best to access people, how best to convince and enable the population to be tested. And that goes without saying, really, for an NHS service. The fact that this had to be learned afresh, really, by those setting up these new structures just, I think, added to delay and would have contributed, unfortunately, to the inequality that exists in our health service. And indeed, as we've seen, COVID has contributed to further inequality in outcomes.
Thank you. Can we then move and have displayed your paragraph 22 and 23? Because you detail within that essentially contact made by you with Deloitte, meeting you attended with Deloitte, and then observations about that experience. Can I ask you, you detail that when you attended that meeting, it became clear that they had no relevant expertise and were urgently seeking answers to some basic questions. Despite already being engaged to lead the aspects of the national testing rollout, are you able to assist us to your views of what the implications were of this approach for the delivery of safe, equitable testing services?
Well, we were all, remember, at this stage of the pandemic, everyone wanted to help out. So when this meeting was called, many of us attended. And as in my witness statement, the questions being asked by the individual representing Deloitte, and she was working for Deloitte, is not an individual problem. I don't have antagonism or any comments on her. She's doing her job, but it was clear that she didn't have, and the Deloitte team didn't have an understanding of some basic aspects of how you package up samples, how you put them in the post, etc. Things that are pretty much standard for those of us in diagnostic virology and infection control. And so it seemed to me, sitting on a call with a large number of experts working in the NHS and universities, advising someone like that on these basic processes, it didn't make me feel that this was going to be as effective as it could have been from those sitting around the table or on that virtual call being asked to develop a system.
Thank you. You also detail in your report, which I'm not going to deal with because it's self-explanatory, the concerns you had about the testing issues in these laboratories. But can we move to your paragraph 28, please, where you reference chairing that Horizon scanning group from the end of March to May of 2020 in the Department of Health and Social Care. And if we go over the page to page 8, you specifically reference that during that meeting, a spreadsheet was provided including potential suppliers, some of these listed separately on a VIP tab. These were the companies which had approached ministers directly, and you were asked to consider them for fast tracking, as in through the Cabinet Office commercial team. And you say this, I refused, because this undermined my wish for an objective, expert-led assessment. You say this, the experience gave me an insight into the contractual mayhem in play. Indeed, there were many criticisms from the consultant virology community of national purchases of testing systems which were not evaluated or were being imposed on their laboratories at the expense of well-established systems.
Yes, that's correct. It was surprising to me that there was such a thing as a VIP tab, even if there had been approaches directly to ministers or others in government. Why was the need to identify that specifically? And I do recall being asked to consider those because of those personal approaches being made.
Thank you. And so, Professor Pillay, would you ask that when we consider your evidence, we see it through the lens and the context of your expertise, but also you had direct liaison with the consultants that were assisting in setting up the strategy and the testing plan, but also you were directly involved with the Department of Health and Social Care in those early stages, horizon planning on what was needed?
Yes.
Can we then please move to your paragraph 31 on page 8? You detail, and going over the page onto page 9, nevertheless, it seemed obvious that local public health structures were ideally placed to receive further investment to grow contact tracing and isolation support for the population, and you go on. Was it foreseeable pre-COVID that existing health inequalities would be exacerbated by both a pandemic and interventions implemented to address it? And should these have been central to the planning and implementation of any test, trace, isolate programme?
Indeed, the period from 2009 to, I think, 2019, there was shockingly a reduction in life expectancy in the UK. I mean, that's an amazing thing for those of us brought up with ever improving health. And that reduction and increased morbidity was particularly the case for those in lower socioeconomic positions and disenfranchised. And therefore, it's clear to many of us that any new intervention or any new health structure needed to focus specifically on how to prevent that inequity being replicated.
Thank you. And are you able to assist us as to your views? Was there any benefit of taking a national approach to test, trace and isolate rather than basing it on existing local public health resources?
Well, I do think there need to be a national strategy. And clearly there need to be collaboration and assimilation of local efforts to the national goal. And of course there would need to be strengthening of local facilities as well. We again have heard, I've heard from others in this module of the reduction in resource in local authorities in particular since 2012. When public health was put into responsibility of local authorities, and we all are aware of how little money and how financially stressed they are, and therefore it was essential that more resource was able to go to those structures to support local responses.
Thank you. Now, Professor Pillay, I think you give some observations as to international comparators and how they support isolation, and particularly with adequate financial support. And if we briefly look at page 10, please, which is a summary of the blueprint for an effective test, trace, isolate system that Independent SAGE proposed, which included the £800 isolation payment. And so can I ask you, in your view, was the UK's failure to provide adequate support for isolation both harmful for individuals, harmful to immediate efforts to limit the spread of infection, and detrimental to the country's ability to recover from the pandemic?
Yes, I'll preface this by saying this is the precise nature of support for those asked to isolate. It's not my own area, and we've just heard from an expert, Professor Machin, on this, but in answer to your question, yes.
Thank you. And then can we then turn finally for my questions, please, to legacy? You say this, one of the most disappointing, indeed in my view, disgraceful outcomes of the test and trace programme is the lack of any meaningful legacy or strategy for the next pandemic threat. Many of us in the field recognise that a significant increase in testing capacity would be needed early during the COVID pandemic, and further, the manner in which this was undertaken will be core to developing a sustainable system for further threats, incorporating surge capacity. By contrast, we witnessed a one-dimensional approach to testing developed through the outsourced model with the establishment of the Lighthouse laboratories. As early as February 2021, concerns were expressed regarding the mothballing of some of the expensive Lighthouse laboratories, at a time when testing will be essential to monitor relaxation of some non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as school reopening and people returning from holidays. Professor Pillay, it's strong language you've used, including the word disgraceful. Is there anything else you wish to add to your views as to legacy expressed in the statement?
Yes. So, firstly, the reason that has been given for the effectiveness of testing as well as the infection control in those countries such as China, Taiwan, South Korea, is that they had previously gone through SARS-1 and had learned from that experience, and therefore they had an infrastructure able to rapidly respond. The fact that we've been through COVID, yet do not have that and not taken advantage of that, I think that is disgraceful. That you know, as a country that has, going back many years, has led globally on infection control, laboratory testing for infectious agents. The fact that we're now in this position, I have to say, with the investment that has gone in, it is, I think, a disgrace.
And I think you deal with that finally in your paragraph 38, where you say, by contrast, despite a reported £37 million spent on the test and trace programme, the United Kingdom has been left with minimal capacity for the next pandemic.
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Pillay, those are my questions. There are
Thank you.
questions.
Mr. Weatherby has some questions. He sits there.
Yes, Professor. I've just got 2 short points on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And I want to, first of all, just pick up important evidence that you've already touched upon in terms of the failure to take advantage of the expertise of clinical virologists and the outsourcing that you referred to. And I want to put to you part of the statement of Dr. Cotgreve. And just for the record, I'll give the reference INQ 000147814, paragraphs 17 and 20. And in Dr. Cotgreve says this, and I quote, "More time was spent by some of our members educating management consultants within government in the basics of infectious diseases, obtaining samples from people, diagnostics and serology, rather than the same members of the Microbiology Society with expertise given authority to establish at speed and scale what they already knew worked from past experience," unquote. And that genuine offers of support were, quote, "turned down or ignored," and the overall impression of official responses to offers of help from genuine experts with real potential to be of potentially life-saving value to the nation was not that they were not needed, but they were not wanted, unquote. Does that resonate with the evidence that you've already given in terms of the effect of the failure to take up the existing expertise?
It does resonate that the Society for General Microbiology that's represented by that statement will overlap somewhat with the clinical virology network, but would also include particularly university academics. Yeah. And so, yes, that does resonate.
Now, you've already been asked about a couple of letters that you and others sent to Professor Whitty and others. You've talked about the issue of outsourcing. Did you raise the issue of outsourcing during this time? And if so, what explanation, if any, were you given about the engagement of companies such as Deloitte's, who had no history or expertise in these areas?
The key way in which I, as an individual, undertook that was through my involvement with Independent Sage, which produced many documents which related to that process of testing and outsourcing. And so in that way, and all of those documents were passed on to senior government ministers.
And were you given any explanation as to the engagement of companies without any history or experience?
No.
Finally, this, picking up the last point you asked about by Ms. Cartwright, is there any reason why the UK should not now develop the infrastructure and testing protocols and planning for a future pandemic, as countries such as South Korea and Taiwan did in response to SARS and MERS 20 years before the COVID outbreak? Is there any reason that that can't be done now?
There's no reason that can't be done now. I'm sure Milady will any recommendations have to be put in the context of finance, but nevertheless, if we are to avoid the same amount of money being spent the next pandemic, then I think it could be done much cheaper with infrastructure. As to, very briefly, the organisation for that, I still think the opportunity is there to have a much more upgraded public health, infectious disease, communicable disease structure. UKHSA is a shadow of what the Public Health Laboratory Service was when I joined it in 1993,
yes.
Which was the envy of the world. And I still think that that is the sort of a framework within which that sort of cooperation amongst different parts of our health service and diagnostic testing can happen.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. That completes the questions we have for you, Professor. Thank you very much indeed for your assistance. And please don't think that because we've had a relatively short time with you that I won't bear very much in mind all that you've put into your very helpful witness statement.
Thank you very much.
So thank you for coming to help us.
My lady, that concludes the evidence in Module 7, and I think we'll move now to the core participants' closing statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cartwright. Ms. Munro, I'm told you're hiding behind a pillar. Oh, you were?
My lady, thank you and good afternoon. I, of course, act on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice, and in these closing submissions, my lady, I will highlight perhaps 6 themes, but by dint of the time allocated, will be brief. In our closing or written submissions, these themes and more will be expanded upon. Where our position aligns with other core participants, I will also and do endorse those submissions to come. And of course, those submissions are made on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland. My lady, in our written opening, we stated that the failings in test, trace and isolate were not merely a case of limited capacity or systems under pressure, but a pattern of missed opportunities, avoidable delays, and a persistent failure to act with urgency. Even when expert advice was being offered, when support was available, and when international models of success were there to be drawn upon. Nothing in the 3 weeks of this module has caused us to alter that analysis of TTI and the system in the UK during the pandemic. Rather, the evidence from a raft of witnesses, many of whom were there at the time, others were experts, instructed by the inquiry, have confirmed and expanded upon that analysis. Theme 1, broken promises. Boris Johnson promised, quote, a world-beating system. Sadly, it was anything but that. We've heard at length in other modules about the lack of infrastructure and under-resourcing. Well, it will come as no surprise to anyone that those factors again reared their head in TTI. The UK entered the pandemic from a position of structural fragility. My lady, we are now 6 modules completed, and we're still hearing the same song. And we all know the lyrics by heart. As your ladyship said to Sir Paul Nurse, and I quote, in this inquiry, everything comes back to planning. And I think his answer was simply yes. The lack of planning, poor foresight, wasted opportunities, and a continued, almost obdurate inability to learn, adapt and prepare were all hallmarks of the government's TTI. The losers, as ever, were the public. We who were left to deal with the fallout, the dangers, and the deaths. As Professor McNally succinctly put it, we were fighting COVID blind. Theme 2, reinventing the wheel. There are many things that people complain about this country. My lady, one thing that we can perhaps all agree with and that we should rightly be proud of are our universities. their research departments, and particularly the scientific research that can stand against anything in the world. Those departments are brimming with talent, knowledge, and expertise. One of the slogans repeatedly said from the broadcasts by the government during the pandemic was that the politicians were following the science. Yet when it came to test, trace, and isolate and support the advice and expertise of some of the foremost scientists in this country, nay, the world, was ignored. Politicians no longer followed the science, but followed the men and women in business suits. The new reality was following the consultants. Professor McNally again, I do believe the university to research institutes and industry labs could have been stood up in February and March 2020 to increase capacity whilst lighthouse labs were established. Professor Pillay emphasised that point as well, and we've just heard from him, and my lady, we would commend his evidence to you, both written and oral, which has been both powerful and very compelling. At a time when clear, bold political leadership was needed, infused with a sense of public duty and responsibility, the government made political choices that flew in the face of that. Our families and the wider public ask a simple question: why? Perhaps an answer to that can be gleaned to some extent by comparing two witnesses, one who was new to the inquiry and one whom we've heard from on a number of occasions. Those individuals being Sir Paul Nurse and Mr. Hancock, the then Health Secretary. Dealing first with Sir Paul, my lady, military and particularly wartime analogies have been made in Module 7. Sir Paul spoke of the universities and institutes who offered their services as analogous to the small boats, of course referencing Operation Dynamo and Dunkirk, which exemplified courage and solidarity in adversity. Sadly, far from embracing our modern little ships and the unique role they could play, the government ignored them, stopping them from even leaving their home ports before they could make any real difference. Sir Paul said, we had the machines and we had the expertise. We had about 50 PCR machines operating in the building, the Crick. We also needed containment facilities, and we had good containment facilities. I mean the sort you find in a local hospital. We had 20 of them, and those were critical. He wrote, of course, that letter on the 14th of April to Matt Hancock. The response from a civil servant, which Sir Paul described as anodyne, came in July. He said, it took 3 months to get this letter. Peter Ratcliffe is a renowned individual. To ignore a letter from 2 Nobel Prize laureates for 3 months is a little surprising. My lady, you may feel, certainly some of our families did, that Sir Paul was being a little humble, a little too humble in his response there. In his view, the government didn't put in place what was necessary at the time because of testing capacity, and they wouldn't acknowledge that they couldn't do it, as that would have exposed their strategy. He goes on to say, what we were doing was public duty. People wanted to help, to volunteer. All that was being thought about was commercial solutions. Finally, Sir Paul added that there was too often empty sloganeering and non-existent successes that took the place of actual purposeful leadership. Mr. Hancock, by contrast, is no stranger to the inquiry, and he continues to be a controversial figure for many of our families. Many were watching online, others travelled, some at some distance and at difficulties to themselves, to listen to him in person that day. My lady, suffice to say, they left the hearing room after his evidence significantly more perturbed, some upset, some angry, and some simply bemused than they had been when they arrived that morning. Mr. Hancock, if nothing else, has always been consistent in his inability to read the room. His responses to questions from Miss Cartwright, King's Counsel, about Sir Paul and Professor Radcliffe, and the failure to utilise the existing talent on the ground within the scientific community, was not to listen or to engage or to consider or to self-reflect. Mr. Hancock's initial response was at best rather disappointing, at worst somewhat churlish, almost literally dismissing the question with a wave of his hand, and the response and characterising the response of these preeminent scientists as, quote, bruised egos. Our families can only sadly conclude, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, my lady, that this is yet another example of the hubris of Mr. Hancock. Theme 3, ignoring international lessons. Some people may be old enough to remember the phrase, think globally, act locally. It was a phrase popularised in the 70s and 80s. Its actual origin is somewhat unclear, but it's widely attributed to the environmentalist David Brower, who adopted it as a slogan for his organisation that he founded, Friends of the Earth. It means, and I think this is right, my lady, that it's about considering the interconnectedness of global problems whilst taking concrete steps within your own locality to address the larger issues that you are thinking about globally. Perhaps if there was one slogan that the government should have adopted and seen a resurgence during the pandemic, it was that slogan. Because other countries were facing the same virus, but they responded with greater urgency, adaptability, clarity of purpose. South Korea and Germany are two examples in particular that took early and effective steps that demonstrated what a timely, trusted, and decentralised response could look like. These were not distant case studies. These strategies were widely reported, discussed by health experts, and praised by international bodies. They were comparable nations in terms of wealth and public health systems. Some of them had learned through previous pandemics. Our family sadly have heard nothing from those ministers, those from Whitehall who have given evidence in this module to explain why our government was unable at the time to learn from other countries. Theme 4, the local-central dichotomy. Myriad witnesses spoke about the misguided policy which concentrated on a centralised system, thus bypassing local skills and resources. Professor McKee, in his witness statements, noted, we emphasise for a system rooted in local communities, integrated with the NHS and led by local directors of public health. We argued that the current private sector on NHS test and trace systems should be replaced with a more effective model. That leverage is local knowledge and the resources we were aware of and the actions taken by the directors of public health, for example, in Leicester, and subsequently emulated by the counterparts in Sandwell and other places. And Greg Fell, my lady, who gave evidence this week, spoke of the local public health system being undervalued by successive governments, demonstrated particularly by a lack of real-term increases in England to the public health grant. Now, of course, the evidence that we've heard suggests very properly that larger labs were needed as well. It wasn't a question of one or the other, but an integrated policy involving both. But where are we now? Well, the elephant graveyard of the Lighthouse labs are another shocking outcome of the pandemic. The Lighthouse labs no longer exist. All equipment has been sold off, all expertise gone. The subsequent closure or scaling back of such infrastructure raises important questions about long-term planning, value for money, and the legacy of pandemic investment. Theme 5, asymptomatic testing. There was not effective asymptomatic testing within the TTI programme. By late January 2020, credible evidence of asymptomatic transmission of the virus had emerged, and by February 2020, there was very much a growing body of evidence that COVID-19 could be transmitted by individuals who showed no symptoms, whether truly asymptomatic or not. But the UK was slow to adapt. There was and there should have been a precautionary approach to routine asymptomatic testing. That did not begin until November 2020. theme number 6, support. My lady, we've heard a lot about the issue of support, and again this morning from Professor Machin. The 2 points about the success of TTI and support are inextricably linked. Self-isolation is an altruistic act, and most people are actually very altruistic, and they want to help. It makes you feel better. You want to be part of that community. But they cannot always do this. Underpinning the ability to be altruistic, the ability to self-isolate, there has to be a proper programme of support, be it financial or otherwise. And yesterday, Professor Arden emphasised and underscored the importance of behavioural science to planning. How people act and how people behave is something that needs to be part and parcel of the planning. There needs to be trust. They need to understand and adhere to certain restrictions. And how is that developed? And how is that message and guidance given? Lady Harding, from her statement, said as follows: the UK spent proportionally much less than any other developed country enabling disadvantaged people to self-isolate. If we had allocated more of the NHS test and trace budget to isolation support, I strongly suspect that fewer would have died and infection rates would have been lower, with all the benefits that would have brought. We had the money in the budget, you know. We didn't spend all of our budget. But I wasn't the decision maker. The decision maker was the Chancellor, and at every opportunity from June onwards, the Chancellor rejected the proposals. Where support was lacking, the vulnerable, the dispossessed, those who were digitally deprived, those most in need, felt it most. These shortcomings within the TTI system in terms of support were compounded by the failure to combat structural and institutional discrimination, in particular around race and disability. My lady, Mr. Gethin, gave particularly trenchant evidence, you may think, in regards to that. Turning then finally to our conclusions. The reality is that the failure to plan and the lack of capacity for TTI and support meant that the UK had far greater mortality and morbidity rates, deaths and serious illness and long COVID. My lady, you will recall the evidence of Professor Naomi Thurlock, who gave evidence on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice. She gave moving testimony initially about her own mother and her journey, and then she spoke about the themes that she wanted to particularly bring out. And she said, quote, "If you have an effective test, trace, isolate and support system, you can both reduce the number of deaths and reduce the number of lengths of lockdown. So for the system to work, all elements must work. So even if you are very good at testing and tracing, if you can't help people, facilitate them to isolate, you're not going to help them to control the spread of the infection." I hope the inquiry can bring cool, calm, rational evidence to this discussion to show how test, trace, isolate and support, together with other pandemic preparedness and responses, can mitigate both the number of deaths and the lockdowns and economic and social damage. I would echo those words of Professor Thurlock, my lady. We do not want in the future to be in a room watching another judge and lawyers bemoan the state of the next pandemic and people one by one standing up and saying, well, why did we not learn the lessons of Lady Hallett's inquiry? Why was those lessons not implemented by government? Because there will be another pandemic. My lady, we invite you and your team to bring cool, calm, rational analysis to your conclusions. And in terms of purposeful leadership, to craft bold recommendations that the present government cannot, we hope, ignore, but that they will bring them in and act upon them expeditiously and comprehensively, because the legacy that Professor Pillay talks about is not one to be proud of at the moment. We are back in the situation of 2020, if not worse, in terms of many aspects such as health inequalities, and that cannot be sustained. My lady, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Munro. Ms Parsons, you can't escape me. I think I saw you over there.
Thank you, my lady. These closing submissions are made on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. As my lady knows, the issue of nosocomial infection for many of the group's members is of paramount importance. That is because so many of them had loved ones who died having caught COVID in hospitals and in care homes, the very places they should have been protected. Given the importance of testing, and in particular asymptomatic testing in the prevention of nosocomial infection, the members of the group have listened with the utmost care to the evidence in this module. What they have heard has angered them. Where is the recognition that delays in testing and failures to test frequently enough actually cost lives? Where is the awareness that far from being a question of hindsight, things could and should have been done better at the time? Where are the reflections on how to do things better in the future? As witness after witness from Wales set about defending the decisions they took, engaging in political point scoring as and when the opportunity arose, members of the bereaved families for Justice Cymru felt that the deaths of their loved ones were treated as, at best, a statistical inevitability and at worst, an irrelevance. This closing is focused on testing, but my lady, that is not the only issue, of course. The tracing programme was inadequate in Wales. Amongst other things, it completely overlooked care homes. And the proximity app, as they called it, introduced presumably because of its anticipated value, had very low take-up levels. Tracing and other matters of concern for the group will be addressed in written submissions. Turning then, my lady, to the first point, delay in recognition by the Welsh Government of the value of asymptomatic testing. The inquiry has heard expert evidence about when the scientific community acknowledged asymptomatic transmission. Professor Fraser told you the evidence of asymptomatic transmission emerged quite clearly throughout February and March 2020. Sir Paul Nurse told the inquiry there was ample evidence from very early on of asymptomatic transmission, and he cited studies in Hong Kong, China, Italy, the cruise ship, and so on. Professor Harries said Public Health England was aware of research from the Centre for Disease Control as early as the 3rd of April 2020 that reported very high levels of asymptomatic transmission in care homes. Their own study, the Easter 6, as she referred to it, confirmed the same. On the 14th of April 2020, the Go Science advice confirmed that asymptomatic infection represents a large proportion of transmission. That was the same date that Sir Paul Nurse and fellow scientists at the Crick Institute wrote to Mr. Hancock to urge asymptomatic testing of healthcare workers, a priority cohort given their potential exposure to the virus and given their proximity to vulnerable people. Mr. Hancock told the inquiry that that was also the date, the 14th of April 2020, from which they started making testing decisions on the basis of asymptomatic transmission. What of the position in Wales? On the 29th of March 2020, Public Health Wales advised that with respect to care homes, if new or existing residents do not have any symptoms, there is no value in testing for the presence of coronavirus. Mr. Drakeford used almost identical language in the Senedd. On the 29th of April 2020, he told the Senedd, when asked about testing in care homes, that the clinical evidence tells us there is no value in doing so. And on the 6th of May, he doubled down and told the Senedd that he had not seen any evidence that asymptomatic testing had any clinical value in homes where there was no coronavirus in circulation. Explanations for these bizarre statements were offered by Mr. Gething to you. He relegated them to the cut and thrust of the debating chamber, and by Dr. Howe, who pointed out that the statement was conditional on there being no coronavirus in circulation. But however one interprets these comments, my lady, one thing is clear. There was no change to their baseline flawed assumption until mid-May 2020. The Welsh Government cited new sage advice of the 12th of May 2020 as the pivotal moment for change. But this entirely misses the point. It wasn't new at all, as has just been set out. The Welsh Government had the scientific evidence. We know that whatever difficulties there may have been with communications at a ministerial level, there was a high degree of collaboration between the UK CMOs, chief scientific advisors, and public health agencies. To quote Dr. Frank Atherton, the science is the same across the 4 nations. What is the explanation for this delay, my lady? Was it incompetence, a failure to appreciate the significance of asymptomatic transmission and the need for testing? Was it a willful disregard for the science, driven by concerns about the testing capacity and the impact of a positive test on staffing levels? Whatever the reason, the delay undoubtedly calls into question the view expressed by Mr. Drakeford in evidence to you, that in Wales, and I quote, "we planned first and then we announced, and sometimes that makes us look like we would do things later than was happening elsewhere, but I believe that our method was more effective." What was more effective, the group asks, about a delay which endangered the lives of so many of the most vulnerable in Wales? The Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru made reference in their opening submission to the question posed by Counsel to the Inquiry in Module 2B, namely whether the Welsh Government's position on asymptomatic testing was a position that could genuinely and reasonably be held. And we submit that it is abundantly clear from the evidence you have heard that it is not. Moving to the second part of these submissions, my lady, delays and failures in the testing regime for priority groups. Care homes first. Nosocomial infections were rife within care homes in Wales, and they were allowed to seed within these settings because of delays and failures to implement proper testing regimes. In the next module, my lady, you will hear from the owner and manager of a care home in North Wales, who was crying out for testing of her residents and staff because it was glaringly obvious to her, as someone working on the front line, that routine testing was essential. Her increasingly desperate messages to the Welsh Government in April and May 2020 included the following warning as to access to testing. "I do not know how long it is going to be before relatives of the deceased speak to one another and realise they are not going to be treated with the same importance as England, less than 9 miles from here. They would be horrified to learn that the Welsh Government has decided it is not important enough." Well, my lady, they have been speaking, and they are horrified. As we know, the Welsh Government delayed routine testing of all hospital patients being discharged into care homes. It issued an apology in its opening submissions. They said this: "There ought not to have been a delay between the 15th of April 2020, when the risk came to the fore, and the publication of guidance on the 29th of April 2020. However, no actual explanation has been provided for that delay. Worse still, there has been no explanation as to why it took until the 16th of May 2020, that's 1 month after the risk came to the fore, to announce routine testing for residents of large care homes, and why it took until the 15th of June, that's 2 months after the risk came to the fore, to announce routine testing of patients in all care homes of all sizes and of care home workers. Lack of testing capacity is an unsatisfactory explanation. It points to a chronic failure to plan and an inability to scale up effectively. It leaves aside the issue of consistent underuse of tests in Wales. Second, healthcare workers. As already mentioned, experts recognised early on that routine testing of healthcare workers was, to quote Sir Paul Nurse, absolutely essential. It would help prevent nosocomial infection, and it would maintain, rather than deplete, workforce levels. However, in Wales, routine testing of healthcare workers was not introduced until the 14th of December 2020. Of course, lateral flow tests only became widely available in November 2020. But, my lady, that does not explain, firstly, why greater use of existing capacity was not used to test before the 14th of December 2020, and secondly, and more importantly, why even when lateral tests were available, routine testing took until the end of March 2021, after Wave 2, to roll out. In January 2021, at the height of Wave 2 and at the height of nosocomial infection in Wales, usage was just 24%. That translates, my lady, to roughly 120,000 tests per week, of which 30% were used. Of which 30,000 were used. That leaves 90,000 tests, my lady, more than enough to test on a weekly basis Wales' healthcare workforce. Various explanations have been put forward to explain underuse of tests in Wales. Mr. Drakeford, in oral evidence, and Mr. Gething in writing, told you that you can't run a system at full throttle. You need to keep some tests back for an emergency, and you need to keep some tests for non-COVID matters. Those points may very well be true, but such explanations cannot justify the scale of underuse. Dr. Howe told you that testing capacity didn't mean sampling capacity. But, my lady, that explanation for underuse is even more troubling. What it means is that by January 2021, Wales had failed to develop sufficient infrastructure such that it could only use 24% of its testing capacity. Routine testing of patients. The Welsh Government announced testing of all patients on admission to hospitals on the 3rd of June 2020 and again on the 15th of July 2020. Reminders had to be sent out to NHS Wales directors in September 2020 because the policy was not being implemented properly. It was not until the 28th of January 2021 that the Welsh Government introduced repeat testing of patients every 5 days. But problems in testing and repeat testing endured, notwithstanding reminders and notwithstanding new policies. The Audit Wales report of March 2021, Test, Trace and Protect, an overview of progress to date, reported that there has been no regular testing during a patient's hospital stay unless patients have developed symptoms. The report concluded that nosocomial infections could have been reduced by more effective testing, including more frequent testing during a patient's stay. This much is known by the group, my lady. Many of their loved ones fell victim to basic testing failures. More frustratingly, witnesses offered no explanation for such failures. As with the failure in routine testing of healthcare workers, blame was simply laid at the door of the health boards. No attempt to explain why this was so. And of course, without insights or reflections, there is no hope for lessons learned. Finally, my lady, one last point before concluding on the range of symptoms. The group observes that alongside the failure to identify infections within vulnerable communities by refusing to test asymptomatically, the Welsh Government also limited symptomatic testing to a narrow range of symptoms. In March 2021, well after wider symptoms were known, Wales continued to confine national messaging to the cardinal 3 symptoms. As Dr. Howe admitted, this decision would have meant people with the virus remained untested. Like so many aspects of the testing regime, the decision-making here demonstrated the very opposite of a precautionary approach in action. To conclude, my lady, delays and failures characterised the testing regime in Wales. Mr. Hancock urged you at the start of his oral evidence not to consider each module in isolation. Issues were inevitably interlinked and developed concurrently. There is much to be said for taking a composite view. Notwithstanding the hard work of many in Wales during the pandemic, failures and delays in testing sat alongside a failure to vaccinate, a failure to ensure proper infection prevention and control, and a failure to provide PPE and other essential equipment. The cumulative effect was devastating on the most vulnerable people in Wales. And unless there is a genuine reflection of what went wrong and lessons learned, failures are destined to be repeated. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Parsons. Ms Mitchell.
My Lady, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. The inquiry heard from the Scottish Government witnesses yesterday and also some relevant expert evidence this morning, and the Scottish COVID bereaved will take time to consider the evidence before making full written submissions to the inquiry. Those submissions will include the familiar themes of the importance of preparedness, the need for data and providing proper support to individuals, as well as specific recommendations relating to the importance of a testing system in protecting the most vulnerable in nursing and care homes. In the opening submissions, the bereaved highlighted that throughout the UK, the lack of attention to the test, trace and isolate system meant that in the early days of the pandemic, work had to be done to try and put in place functioning systems. Instead of using experts who understood virology, creation of new system was outsourced. As this module proceeded, the Scottish COVID bereaved could not help but think of the time, money and lives lost as a result of the original long-standing failures to have in place the necessary systems. The Scottish COVID bereaved are alarmed to hear the evidence of the dismantling of this crucial testing infrastructure built up over the pandemic and share the concerns of Professor Pillay. Whilst these systems might not be the focus of immediate political concern or media headlines, they are essential to the health of the nation. As Lord Bethell told the inquiry, there is a direct link between the defunding prevention-style public health and not being ready for the next pandemic. Any system of test, trace and isolate can also only be effective if the people identified can be supported. The use of the stick of enforcement and fines rather than the carrot of support led to many of our lowest paid and most vulnerable being forced to choose between isolating and supporting themselves. The inevitable consequences of those choices was highlighted in the evidence of Baroness Harding, who gave evidence that if more money had been allocated from the test and trace budget to isolation support, she strongly suspected that fewer would have died and infection rates would have been lower. Many of the bereaved came into this module, and indeed this inquiry, with specific concerns, amongst many others, about the discharge of COVID-positive patients from hospitals into care and nursing homes without testing, the issue of asymptomatic testing, about the lack of routine testing for residents or staff, about the movement of staff between care homes without testing, and with testing being restricted to those displaying the so-called cardinal symptoms. There has been little in this module to assuage those concerns. No doubt more will be heard on these topics in the next module. The bereaved took the contents of the correspondence from Ed Humferson to Scott Held, the of Public Health Scotland, that the data was consistent with a causal relationship between positivity and outbreak to be self-evident. It appears to the bereaved that, even at the time, the only ones who failed to grasp this link were the politicians and civil servants in charge of developing and implementing policies. Many of the bereaved knew that the discharge of positive patients, or patients for whom no test had been carried out, was causing loss and suffering in our care and nursing homes. The bereaved are still struggling to understand why this obvious point seems so difficult to grasp. In this module, the representatives of the Scottish Government relied upon by now a familiar lament that decisions taken by the UK Government had impacts on finances available to the Scottish Government. While the bereaved have some sympathy with that position and consider that more could and should have been done to fund the response to the pandemic, they note that there is unlikely to be a government in Europe or indeed worldwide that didn't wish to have more funds available to it during the pandemic. It is by looking at the budgets and examining what a government were and were not willing to fund during the pandemic that priorities can be seen. Whilst the Scottish Government say that they would have liked to have seen a longer transition to the Test and Protect scheme in Scotland, but were constrained by a reduction in funding, the question does remain as to what sacrifices were considered to allow the scheme to continue for longer. As in Module 5, the bereaved appreciate that, whatever criticisms may be levelled, there was a great deal of hard work and dedication from a great number of public servants, scientists, testing staff and others who are trying their best to help the public. The bereaved wish to thank them and the people of Scotland who tested and isolated for all their efforts. These are the oral submissions of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Very well, I think we shall break there and I shall return this afternoon at 1:55.
Thank you.